All right, tonight we begin lesson 5 of Advice for Life, the Rebbe's advice on multiple areas of life. We've discussed various types of advice, whether it was financial advice. I forget already what lesson 2 is about. Family, there we go. Advice for family relationships. The third lesson was advice for physical health. The fourth lesson was advice for mental health, and now we are at lesson 5. We're nearing the end of this wonderful journey, fascinating insights and new horizons and perspectives on how to see things. And so tonight is going to be no different. We will focus on adversity, challenges that we face in various areas of life. To say the story where Yankel is going on a journey. He is driving and unfortunately he gets hit by a car and he is rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance is bringing him in, the attending physician, as they're rolling him in and on his gurney, he sees he's sitting there, he's smiling. The attendant physician says, "Excuse me, so what's your name?" "Yankel." "Okay, Yankel, how are you feeling? Are you comfortable?" He says, "Well, I make a living." um, I said another story, the typical story in a kosher restaurant where there's three elderly Jewish women sitting around the table, and the waiter walks over and says, "Excuse me, women, is anything okay?" And they say, what's Jewish optimism and Jewish pessimism? Jewish pessimism is, Yankel goes and he says, we've hit rock bottom. The situation can't get any worse. And the Jewish pessimist says, "Oh, yeah, it can." So when it comes to adversity, when it comes to challenges that we face in life, there's various areas and various perspectives perhaps that we can have. And tonight we will focus on the Rebbe's advice in these areas, which is really gleaned from thousands upon thousands of letters that we have, correspondence from the Rebbe to various people reaching out, requesting on how to deal with adverse situations. And tonight we will focus on a number of those as an example to see the Rebbe's advice and perspective on these ideas, on challenges, on adversity. And I just want to point out from the get-go, we're not going to be touching upon extreme tragedy. We're not going to be discussing the Holocaust. We won't be discussing even personal tragedy. That's a discussion for a different time. Perhaps we may be able to glean some insights from tonight's topic, if we'd like, in our own lives. But really, tragedy has its own dimension and own really spotlight in the Rebbe's advice. And so we're not going to be focusing on tragedy. The challenges, adversity that we're discussing today are really, perhaps we can call them, in the face of tragedy, minor challenges. And, they may not be minor, but in the face of larger tragedy, especially as we're reeling from what occurred on Simchas Torah, this past Simchas Torah, the attack on Israel and really the attack on us all. We're not talking about major tragedies or personal major tragedies, but rather adversity that we may face, whether situational, from other people, or from within ourselves. Those are really the challenges that we will be focusing on today, the adversity that we're focusing on today, and perhaps that will become slightly clearer as we go along. So before we get into the text, before we get into the meat and potatoes of tonight's class, I want to begin with a story that isn't mentioned in today's textbook. It isn't put there. The text isn't there, but it's a story from the Talmud. And the Talmud relates about Rabbi Akivah. You've heard of Rabbi Akivah. He is perhaps one of the greatest Talmudic sages that ever lived. He lived, if I recall correctly, the end of the first century, so roughly about 2,000 years ago. Quoted very often in the Talmud. And when we talk about adversity or especially challenges in life, I guess he perhaps is one that withstood many, many challenges and had lots of adversity in his life, beginning from even on a personal level. He only began studying Torah when he was 40 years old. Until the age of 40, he had never studied Torah. And yet he went on to become one of the greatest Jewish sages of all times. And the Talmud relates a story that He was once traveling and didn't make proper travel plans. Perhaps because they didn't have telephones in those days, they didn't have internet. You couldn't, book hotels on hotels.com or Marriott.com or your favorite hotel. It was kind of hard to book hotels and lodging in advance. And so he arrives at this little village and attempts to find a place to stay overnight. And doing some door knocking, as one does, um, he's returned empty-handed. He doesn't have a place to stay. And so he trudges out to the outskirts of town, finds a little secluded spot in the woods, and decides to rest there for the night. Together with him, he's got his phone that serves all purposes. No, it's before phones. So together with him, he's got a few trusty little things that we kind of take for granted today, but in those days, they needed all of them. He has his candle with him. It's at night. You want to be able to study Torah. You want to read. It's your nightlight. It's to do anything. You need to have a candle. He has his candle with him. He has his rooster with him. What's the purpose of a rooster? Wake-up call, his alarm clock, and he has his donkey with him, probably to schlep his stuff, maybe himself. And those are the three items that Talmud tells us he has with him. He probably had his clothing with him as well, some Torah scrolls, personal scrolls to study from. And he's there in the wooded area, and suddenly it gets late at night, and he hears a commotion coming from the town. There was a gang of robbers, a gang of thieves, who descended upon the city and cleaned the city out. But there was a miracle that occurred. And just before this gang of robbers arrives, a wind comes and blows out his candle. He can't relight it. He's stuck. He doesn't have a candle. And he says a very powerful statement. He says, Kol ma da'avid rachmana litav avid. It's an Aramaic statement, and it loosely translated is everything that the merciful one does, the merciful one does, is for the good. Important statement. We'll get back to it. And then what happens? A cat arrives, and a cat eats his rooster. It croaks its last, and he's left without an alarm clock. And once again, he says the statement, everything that God, that the all-merciful one does is for the good. And finally, his donkey dies as well. And once again, he says his statement, everything that the all-merciful one does is for the good. And shortly thereafter is when the band of robbers descend upon the city and empty it out and cause lots of damage and destruction. And so Rabbi Akivah, when relating the story to his fellow colleagues later on, he said, this is what I meant. Everything that the all-merciful one does is for the good. Because look what happened. Had I had a candle, they would have seen me in the wooded area. Had I had a rooster, it would have made noise. Had I had a donkey, it wouldn't ate. All of these things would have happened and would have given up my hideout in the woods. And yet, miraculously, God took from me the candle, the donkey, the rooster, and in turn, that created a tremendous miracle where I got out with my life. That is the first story. That is the first statement. Everything that God does is for the good. Let's move on to a second story. This is going to be in your books on page 120, text 1. Also a quote from the Talmud, a powerful quote from the Talmud, and an important quote from the Talmud, a story from the Talmud. And this will be perhaps complement the earlier story of Rabbi Akivah, but as well as contrast the earlier story. Let's have a look in text 1 of tonight's class. Why did they call him Nachum ish Gamzu? Literally, the Gamzu man. What is this talking about? Rabbi Akivah, the aforementioned great Rabbi Akivah, had a teacher. And he had many teachers, but one of his teachers' names was Nachum. That was his teacher's name, Nachum. Nachum is actually a common, not that common, but not so uncommon. It's a Jewish name till today. The name Nachum, one of the prophets' names was, one of the prophets' name was Nachum. And in Russian, many Russian Jews have that name. The Russian equivalent would be Naum. Either way, Nachum, that was the name of this sage, the teacher of Rabbi Akivah. And Nachum was called Nachum ish Gamzu, right? Perhaps that was his last name, but it was really a moniker, a motive, a motto by which he lived. What does Gamzu mean? So the Talmud is discussing and really analyzing, how did he get this nickname? Right? We can think of various people who have nicknames, but The Talmud is analyzing this one. Why did they call him Nachum ish Gamzu, the Gamzu person? And here the Talmud relates the story, because no matter what would happen to him, he would respond, Gamzu letova. This too is for the good. And the Talmud relates a story. Once the Jews wished to send the Caesar a gift to gain his favor. They asked themselves, who should we send to present this gift on our behalf? Why don't we send Nachum ish Gamzu? After all, he regularly experiences miracles, and we need one right now. They provided Nachum with a chest filled with jewels and pearls as the gift and sent him on his way. During his journey, he had to spend a night in a certain inn. During the night, the folks living at that inn surreptitiously removed all the valuables from the chest and refilled it with plain soil. The next day, Nachum realized what had happened. Unfazed, he trustingly declared, Gamzu letova, this too is for the good, right? He's seemingly lost his marbles. You see, you have a chest full of gold and diamonds. You're going to gain favor in the eyes of the Caesar, the Roman Caesar. Perhaps make an about face. No, said Nachum. Gamzu letova, this too is for the good. What happens? Nachum arrived at the Caesar's palace and dutifully presented his gift. The royal officers opened the chest and saw that it was filled with soil. The Caesar roared, the Jews are mocking me, and was about to execute the Jewish emissaries. Unfazed, once again, Nachum ish Gamzu trustingly declared, Gamzu letova, this too is for the good. Just then, Elijah the prophet appeared before the Caesar in the guise of his trusted minister. He suggested, perhaps this is a special soil from the Jewish patriarch Abraham. When he threw soil in his war against the four kings, it miraculously turned into swords mid-ear. When he threw stubble, it turned into arrows. The Romans were then at war with a province that had proven itself indomitable. They took some of this earth, tested it by throwing it toward the enemy lines, and rapidly conquered that province as a result. When the Caesar realized that the gift of soil indeed contained miraculous powers, he ordered his servants to enter his treasury and to fill the chest with precious jewels and pearls. He presented the chest to Nachum ish Gamzu as a token of appreciation and sent him off with great honor. So what's the idea? Here is Nachum, who always had this almost unflinching, or not almost, he had an unflinching attitude that everything is for the good. Even in the face of such disaster, pending disaster, he figured, if God's doing it, it must be for the good. But if you analyze the two stories that we just discussed, the story of Rabbi Akivah and the story of Nachum ish Gamzu, perhaps it seems that they are exactly the same. And their attitudes and this almost cavalier outlook on life is one and the same. But there is a key difference that seems to arise. And that is by analyzing their statements. What did Rabbi Akivah say? Rabbi Akivah said everything that the All-Merciful does is for the good. Nachum would say this is for the good. The difference is subtle but profound. Everything that God does is for the good means that right now it isn't good. This isn't good. There will be a good outcome in the future, but this current situation isn't good. Take the story of Rabbi Akivah. Was him losing his donkey good? Was him losing his rooster good? No. But it led to something good in the future. Whereas Nachum's outlook was, this is for the good. The fact that the jewels were switched out, this itself is for the good. There's a better outcome. And we'll see this attitude, the difference perhaps between Rabbi Akivah and Nachum, and we'll see the difference between their two outlooks and perhaps two stages in the same outlook within the Rebbe's advice to people when facing adversity, when facing challenges, when facing bumps in life. And perhaps we can say that these two stories really embody the ideas that we discussed in the past, last week, 2 weeks ago, the idea of trust and belief. Whereas belief is, look, I don't know that it's good. I believe that it will be good in the future. Trust is, I know it's good now. I trust God. I trust that everything that God does is good, is for the good. Perhaps you can say that that is the difference between these two ideas. One is saying this is actually good, and the other is saying that the outcome will be good, but this perhaps isn't good. And we'll see these two ideas crystallized as we go along. We're going to bring, let's see how many stories we have here today. Today we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 stories of the Rebbe that will crystallize this idea as we go along. 8 pieces of stories, not just stories, but stories of the Rebbe giving people advice. And we will see these ideas crystallize. The first story that we have today is actually a story about the Rebbe himself, his own life. And the story takes place in the end of 1977. In 1977, it was Simchas Torah, and I was never there, but not that I can remember, but I've heard lots of descriptions. And let's just take a step back and try to analyze what was going on in 770. Right? Some of you, perhaps, maybe not. I don't think anyone actually has ever been to 770 Chabad World Headquarters. If anyone is considering a trip, there is a trip, a Chabad trip called Shabbat in the Heights coming up in May. It's a great trip. It's a great experience. And if you'd like to join, please let me know. Opportunity to go see the headquarters of Chabad, and where thousands of emissaries receive their lifeline and their energy, and the Rebbe's synagogue, the Rebbe's resting place, and so on and so forth. Either way, getting back to 770. So 770 is the boiler room of the world. It's the boiler room of the spiritual world. It's where the energy, where the Rebbe's synagogue and the Rebbe, year in, year out, especially as it came to the most joyous day on the calendar, Simchas Torah, it was a scene to behold. Thousands upon thousands of Jews packed like sardines in the main synagogue of 770 and would dance for hours on end. And in 1977, it seemingly started off the same. It's Simchas Torah, it's Shmini Atzeres, it's the evening, the evening before Simchas Torah. It's the night where we dance hakafot, we dance in a circle over and over again, the joy of the Torah, the joy of the completion of the Torah. It is the most joyous time. The Rebbe would encourage the singing, the dancing. It was a scene to behold, and my father relates that scene with such enthusiasm, such gusto. He was there many, many times, and it's a scene that seems to be one that is seared in his mind greater than any other scene with the Rebbe in 770. The joy in that room was palpable. The excitement was one like no other. Came 1977, and something drastic occurred. Thousands of Jews, Chassidim, followers of the Rebbe, packed into the room, and suddenly the Rebbe asks for a chair in the middle of the dancing. Unheard of. And what occurred was, and became clear within the next 30 seconds, was that the Rebbe was suffering a terrible heart attack. Within moments, all thousands, however many thousands there were, emptied 770 to give the Rebbe ear. Water was passed, doctors were summoned, and long story, perhaps for a different time, the Rebbe encouraged that the hakafot be completed, all 7 encirclements, while the Rebbe was experiencing the heart attack. All 7 encirclements of the synagogue should continue, and they should dance, and the Rebbe danced a little bit. And within no time, the Rebbe's room was transformed into a I don't know what it's called. I don't know the technical term, but right, the ICU for cardiologists, for cardiology, for the heart, and major cardiologists came in from the entire world, from the entire United States, to care for the Rebbe. And it was a touch and go situation for quite a while. The Rebbe suffered another heart attack some 24 hours later. And at the eve of following the holiday, actually, the Rebbe spoke publicly for all his followers. And it's quite a fascinating story. Perhaps for another time, we've discussed the story a number of times, but this is the gist of the story. Now, for the followers in 770, it was quite a shocking moment. It was a moment of uncertainty. This is the most joyous day on the calendar, and the Rebbe is in this touch and go situation. The Rebbe is experiencing this terrible situation. It was unknown at the time what was going on. There was no WhatsApp. There was no texting. There was no, fast flow of information, and it was quite a scary time, especially for all the Rebbe's followers. Suddenly, there's an announcement, and one of the rabbis gets a message from one of the Rebbe's secretaries, and the Rebbe's secretary comes out and tells this rabbi that the Rebbe would like him to share with everyone the following. There was a doctor who came in, a cardiologist who came in, and they were taking the Rebbe's blood. And the Rebbe turned to the doctor and said, with the needle, the syringe, when it's used, what causes the blood to flow? Is it the prick of the needle, or is it the vacuum of the syringe? And the doctor responded, told the Rebbe, that although the prick of the needle allows the blood to come out, but it's actually the vacuum of the syringe that draws the blood out of the body. And the Rebbe said that someone once came to him, the Rebbe responded to the doctor, and the Rebbe said, someone once came to him complaining of being void and empty. And he said because he's void, he's empty, he has this feeling of emptiness, he was incapable of accomplishing anything. I told him, the Rebbe told the doctor, that on the contrary, when there's emptiness, when there's a vacuum, it suctions in much more. The fact that he feels empty, that makes him an even better vessel for all things good and holy. And the Rebbe requested that his secretary relate this message to the rabbi to share to all those who were gathered there. The idea is that yes, there's an emptiness. Yes, the Rebbe's not there and encouraging everyone to sing and dance, and it was the life of the party in 770 every single year. But that vacuum shouldn't lead to a decline in the joy and the celebration of the holiday. On the contrary, it should lead to everybody. That vacuum should lead to the drawing out of blood. What does blood symbolize? Life, vitality. It should lead to a doubling of the efforts of the dancing and the singing. And following that message, the joy in 770, the joy from the followers who were there was actually doubled and tripled and quadrupled. Some of the rabbis that I was, my colleagues, that when I was preparing the class tonight, they shared they were there at that time, and they said this is absolutely true. The joy that was felt at that time was perhaps unparalleled by any other year. This is the idea that perhaps this is somewhat like Rabbi Akivah. This itself, the heart attack, is it good? We don't see the good in it. But what can come from it is a doubling of the joy. It's a vacuum that it's a doubling of the joy. It's a more intense joy that wouldn't have been there had this adversity not occurred. And perhaps to paraphrase a metaphor which is utilized within the Torah countless times is the idea of an olive. And it's apropos for the current Torah portions, which discuss the lighting of the menorah and the lighting of the menorah was specifically with olive oil. What happens with an olive? When does the oil come out? If you take an olive and you try to light it, I don't know if it's going to light. Perhaps it'll burn. I don't know if it's going to light properly. You have to get the olive oil. How do you get the olive oil? By crushing the olive. By crushing the olive, that's when the oil comes in. Same idea in life. In life, when we hit these snags in the road, when we hit these bumps, and here's the situation, it's a natural occurrence. It's a heart attack. It can be something that for the Rebbe and for the followers could have been an opportunity to kvetch. It could have been an opportunity to be sad, to be depressed. And yet what did the Rebbe say? Let's turn it on its head. This Everything that God does is for the good. And what's the good here? Let's bring out the good by redoubling our efforts to have more intense joy. That's the first story of tonight. The second story of tonight is a story that took place a year after that, in 1979. This story let's see, every year, I believe it's every year, maybe it's every other year. Either way, there's the organization of Chabad women, perhaps, ladies' auxiliary of synagogues. There always was, there still is in many places, right? And here at Chabad, we have Jewish Women's Circle. And so the women of Chabad internationally, not only the emissaries, but even the women that live in, any Chabad woman in the world, there is an organization called Neshei Chabad, the women of Chabad. It's a ladies' auxiliary of Chabad, and every year they get together somewhere in the world for a weekend, a conference, to strengthen each other, to encourage each other to strengthen their efforts, as family workshops and workshops on teaching Torah to others, to people they come in contact with, and so on and so forth. And so in 1979, that conference, it was a very small group of women, perhaps. That conference took place in, I believe it was Detroit. Let's see. That conference took place in February of 1979. Perhaps quite the interesting choice of location, quite cold, which we'll see is quite an important point of the story. In February of 1979, a group of some 20 women traveled from Brooklyn to Detroit, Michigan for the Chabad Women's Convention. And we'll hear it from the women themselves as they relate the story here in the next two clips and the Rebbe's interaction with this story. Let me pull it up on the screen.
To bring the Neshei Chabad convention in Detroit, Michigan. Let's say 20 ladies went. Figure out how many children did we leave at home. Baruch Hashem, on Ainora.
It was in February 1979, and Monday morning, the women, took off for the airport because they were all planning to travel home.
In Brooklyn, in the shadow of Grand Army Plaza, some parts of Eastern Parkway are plowed out. But as you can see here, other parts of the parkway are not at all plowed. These cars stuck and good.
The Rebbe hat geholfen. There was a terrible snowstorm. So all the ladies are sitting at the airport in Detroit. No planes.
To give you an idea how bad it is and how long it may take for New York City to dig itself out of all of this snow, that tow truck is attached to this city's snowplow.
Miriam Popak's the head of Neshei Chabad out-of-town conventions at the time. Now her daughter, Mrs. Feldman, took over. She went to the telephone and she called New York.
They have to get home, and here's the snowstorm, and they all began panicking, and they asked my mother to call up 770 and ask the Rebbe for a bracha. They should be able to travel home. These are the words of the Rebbe. Monday, Chaf Bei Shvat. The Baal Shem Tov's teaching that every occurrence contains a directive in serving Hashem is a topic that has been spoken of and discussed at length innumerable times. I am sure that you too have given speeches on this topic. Yet now, when an incident has happened to you, you seek to attach the most distorted possible interpretation. That is absolutely amazing. The simple and obvious reason for the delay is this. It is possible to disseminate Torah and mitzvot to a far greater degree than was accomplished during the convention. You are therefore being granted the merit through the snow which descends from heaven of completing the above task with an extraordinary abundance and intensity of Judaism, similar to the extraordinary abundance of the snowfall. Your efforts in completing the convention's task of disseminating Torah and mitzvos should be extended to the city, the airport, publicity in the newspapers, etc.
Women ran around the airport giving out Shabbos candles.
Some women went off to the university campus. Some of them set up different booths in shopping malls, also with Shabbos candles and talking to the women about all the mitzvahs of the Jewish women. After they reported to the Rebbe of everything they had done, this is what the Rebbe answered. It is a particularly great merit when the Almighty points with a finger and clearly shows one what to do from on high. May all your activities undertaken as a result of this divine indication be highly successful. It is obvious that each and every woman will soon travel and reach home, for she will have completed her mission.
Story is a fascinating story because it really crystallizes this idea. The idea that there was a group of women, 20 women, many children stuck at home, and they were concerned. Major blizzard in New York in 1979, that meant a few days, perhaps even a week, being stuck behind. And I don't remember, but that's my understanding. It's before my time. And perhaps here in Los Angeles, we don't really have an understanding of the magnitude of such a blizzard, but some of us are from the East Coast. And, I recall the blizzard of 96. It was quite a big blizzard. I didn't have any flight to catch, but I definitely recall it and the fun we had. But the idea over here is, right, here's a group of women. And these are Chabad women, so perhaps the most powerful and, greatest women leaders in the world, or just leaders in the world. And they're catching, right? They're requesting a blessing. There's a blizzard. They want to get back home. They traveled here for a good purpose, but it's Monday morning and their husbands are with their kids and it's time to go home. And what does the Rebbe respond to them? And this is verbatim from the answer from the Rebbe. You can see it on text 3, the answer that she read earlier. This is the answer that the Rebbe wrote to share with these women. And the Rebbe said, what are you catching about? Obviously, there's something great for you to accomplish that couldn't have been accomplished any other way. Go and accomplish that. When you accomplish that, you'll be able to go home. And not only that, you're doing something, you're accomplishing something that wouldn't have been able to be accomplished earlier. And it's an idea that you yourselves have shared countless times, that everything that God does is for the good. This too, perhaps even more, the idea of Nachum ish Gamzu, this too is for the good. This actual delay by being stuck in Detroit is for the good. Why is that for the good? Because now you have an opportunity to meet women in the airport, to meet people in the malls, to meet people in the streets, to talk to the news that are there, as we saw, right? To talk to the news about being stuck in the airport and all the good that you will accomplish. And that's actually what they did. They went ahead, they accomplished something that they wouldn't have been able to accomplish otherwise. And there are women till today that are lighting Shabbos and holiday candles as a result of that delay. Some 40-odd years later, there are women that are still lighting Shabbos candles every single week as a result of that blizzard. So it's not if life gives you lemons, make lemonades. It's not lemons. It's the best grapes you can possibly have, and now make the wine from it. It's the best opportunity you have. It's not something negative that has happened and now transform it to positive. What has happened is the most positive occurrence, and it happened by divine design. This is the best thing that could have happened. Which really is underscored in the story of Nachum ish Gamzu. If you think about the story, right, here's Nachum. He's going to find favor, to gain favor in the eyes of the Roman emperor, the Caesar. And it was a tough time for the Jewish people. They never really, first, second, third centuries, never really found full favor in the eyes of the Caesar, right? They're the ones who destroyed the temple. They're the ones who exiled the Jewish people. Jewish people suffered miserably at the hands of the Roman leadership. And here's Nachum going to gain favor in the eyes of Caesar. And what does he do? He's going to bring a treasure chest filled with gold, silver, and diamonds that perhaps the entire Jewish community gathered together in order to hopefully appease Caesar and get whatever they wanted. It's part of a greater story of what was attempting to be accomplished. And the Rebbe analyzes the story and says, bringing diamonds to Caesar is almost like bringing shoes to a shoe store. Don't you think Caesar had much diamonds? Yes, everyone who has riches wants more riches, but it's almost like it pales in comparison to what Caesar already had. Yet what happens when Nachum went to this inn and the sand was switched out? The jewels was switched out for sand. It's not that life gave him lemon and he made lemonade from it. No, what happened was something transformative. It transformed into this miraculous sand, this miraculous dust that was something that Caesar didn't have, could have never gotten on his own, and helped him fight a battle that he had been fighting for quite a while, and suddenly he was able to emerge victorious. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He got something that was priceless. Yeah, I'm sure there's a few Imries in the world, perhaps Israel can use some of that miraculous sand right now. Imagine taking a handful of sand and each grain is transformed into missiles and bullets and rockets. Quite dangerous weaponry, but something that Caesar definitely did not have. So on the contrary, it's not just Nachum took lemons and transformed them into lemonade. Nachum got rid of the lemons, the jewels, the diamond, the gold, which perhaps would have or wouldn't have been helpful, and it was transformed into something that was beyond his wildest dreams. Which perhaps gives us an understanding that in life, Nachum could have kvetched. He could have said, "Oi, it went from gold and silver and jewels and diamonds to sand. What a disaster." Or he said, "You know what? It's from God. This too is for the good. It's good. It's going to be good. It's good right now. It's better than what would have been." We hit little bumps in the road. We hit challenges, some big, some small, right? We have situations that occur to us. These situations are for the good. Perhaps we'll see it the way Rabbi Akivah sees it. It's not good, but it'll definitely bring a good outcome. Or perhaps we will see it like Nachum sees it. This is for the good. But the Rebbe would counsel people and tell people we ought to see it one of these two ways, because that's truly the way it is. Which brings us to the next story. The next story, it's really three stories mixed together. It's kind of political stories, perhaps, of old politics, Israeli politics. But we're moving from the situational adversity, which are the two stories of the heart attack and the snowstorm that we just shared, to personal stories. So stories of other people. Yeah, we all have different types of challenges. We have challenges of our fellow human beings. We have difficulties we encounter with other people. And how do we deal with that type of adversity? It's almost beyond our control. It's other people who are trying to challenge us, who are trying to, throw obstacles in our way. How do we deal with those challenges? And for that, we're going to turn. To a few stories. Let's begin with the first two stories, which is the stories of Israel. What are the stories of Israel? There's two stories in Israel. We have two individuals, and it's a story. It's stories related in Hebrew, but they have footnotes, subtitles. The first individual that we see is Mr. Ron Nachman. Ron Nachman was an Israeli political leader. He founded the Judean town of Ariel, which is quite a large town today. It has its own university, etc. And Nachman had lots of support from many of his constituents, and he had a lot of support from the Rebbe. He comes by the Rebbe for dollars multiple times, if I recall correctly. And in 1990, he comes to the Rebbe, and as we'll soon see, and he relates that he's feeling persecuted and harassed by some of his political enemies, and requests from the Rebbe a response from that. A blessing that his political enemies' plots and efforts be foiled. And we'll see the Rebbe's response to that. The second story that we have is a story from the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. We've seen some of his stories in the past. I've shared some of his stories from the past. May he live and be well. Rabbi Lau was a famous was a Holocaust survivor as a child, and he went on to become chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo, and later on he became the chief rabbi of Israel. One of the most respected rabbis throughout the world. The personal claim to fame. He's one of the rabbis that ordained me as a rabbi. Either way, he was building, as chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo, he was building a mikvah, and he faced some challenges there from some of his opponents, and it's fascinating to see the advice the Rebbe gave him. So let's see these two stories as they are shared by the people that experienced them.
ואחרון חביב, אם מותר לי לבקש בשביל עצמי פעם משהו, יש הרבה אנשים שרודפים אותי, בגלל זה שאני מצליח לעשות את כל הדברים האלה, ועושים לי כל מיני בעיות בנושא של חקירות ומשטרות, איך אני מביא כסף מאמריקה, ואיך אני עושה את כל הדברים. הייתי מבקש שהרבי ייתן לי ברכה, שכל הדברים האלו שעושים נגדי לא יעלה בידי אף אחד, ושאני אצא מכל הדברים האלה חזק ומחוזק.
להיות בעל הבית על המחשוב של איש אחר, זהו אי אפשר, כי הקדוש ברוך עצמי נצא בכי וחפשי, בכל לכת ואחת כבני ישראל. אבל מה שאתה יכול לבקש, שהוא יפיל מזה כל הזיק, ואדרבה זה יהיה עת יותר, את הפסיקה יותר, כי טבע של יהודים, שהם רואים שמישהו מתנגד, אז הם מתעורר אצלם רצון לעשות דווקא ככלל.
Wir haben Mittwoch behulte gestimmt, das erste Mal am Mikve, Fschitte von Chabad in Tel Aviv, das wird bei Boral Gabebor, neben Kikar Dizengoff auf Rechon Parkova. Wenn ein Stück alle Arumpen geschehen ist, wir sind nicht gewähnt, als Sache, kommt man im letzten 15 Jahren.
Ich weiß nicht, an der Dinge, wenn geht es stark, kommen aus den Gewähnchen nie und plötzlich machen die Tiere. Wenn die das dann haben wollen, dann wird das ein Jahr. Schaut sich, wenn ein Jahr und dann macht man noch ein Jahr, ist sie nach dem meisten Welt im Klub.
Das ist gewähnt ein starker Jahr.
Aber es ist ein Batten beraten gewesen, weil er hat die Bütze für mich. Dann nehmen wir sie bei den Dingen noch stärker. Weil es steht auf Loch Rabbi.
So what's going on in these two stories? In these two stories, the first one, right, what does the Rebbe tell him? Yes, you have enemies, but you know what you should do with those enemies? Ignore them. Double your efforts. You can't control your enemies. You can't decide that they should be more powerful, less powerful, that they should think more about you, they should not think about you. That's beyond your control. What should you do? Double your efforts. So here, what's the idea? Like Rabbi Akivah, it may not be a good thing that they are harassing you, your political opponents, but you know what you should do with it? Double your efforts. So that should be the catalyst. That harassment, that seeming negativity or real negativity, don't let it take you down. On the contrary, let it be the catalyst that spurs you to double your efforts in everything that you're doing. Don't let the adversity take you down. You take down the adversity by doubling your efforts of doing good. And then we have a second story. Second story is Rabbi Lau. What's Rabbi Lau? Incidentally, that individual who's standing between the Rebbe and Rabbi Lau, that's my uncle, who's the head Chabad emissary to Tel Aviv, to the greater Tel Aviv area. Nowadays, those days there weren't that many Chabad emissaries in Tel Aviv. Nowadays, if I'm not mistaken, there's about 75 couples, Chabad emissaries in Tel Aviv, one of the largest cities in Israel, the most Chabad houses. My uncle was sent by the Rebbe in 1976 to be the emissary to Tel Aviv. There was already a tremendous Chabad presence in Tel Aviv, but the Rebbe wanted to infuse kind of young blood and American blood. My uncle's from Canada, to infuse young blood into Tel Aviv, and it really had exponential growth since then. Either way, getting back to the topic of the story. So it's beyond the scope of tonight's class. It's a complex halachic, legal issue. but there are differences in opinion on how to build a ritual bath, how to make a mikvah. And Rabbi Lau, as chief rabbi, and he's the one who has the say of all religious matters in the city, he had approved the building of a mikvah according to the Chabad rabbinic authorities. And for whatever reason, he faced opposition. What he says, was the greatest opposition he's ever faced in over 15 years. I believe that was the length of his term up until that point as chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And he's asking the Rebbe for a blessing. What is he supposed to see from this, from this adversity, from these challenges that he's received from the other parties who are trying to, find something negative about building a mikveh? And the Rebbe highlights an important legal rule. The Talmud relates that if you have a document, right, and the document is attesting to the fact a certain loan, right, and this document, it says that Jack borrowed from Max $100. So what does Jack say? Document's a fraud. The document's a fraud. The document is a fake. It was done with Photoshop. It was done with Canva. Someone made up a document. And then they bring professional witnesses, and then they bring proofs, and they bring, testing the ink and testing the paper, and it's proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that this document is 100% valid. It's 100% authenticated. According to the Talmud, according to the Torah ruling, this document can never be questioned again. Once it is verified, once it is authenticated, that authenticity is stronger than it ever was, stronger than the get-go. Says the Rebbe to Rabbi Lau. Up until now, perhaps you had a question about what you're doing was right or wrong, but now you went ahead, you fulfilled the mission. You fulfilled the mikvah. Right now, the mikvah is stronger than it ever was. The people who attacked Rabbi Lau's effort to build this mikvah, what they had done is, instead of weakening it, they had inadvertently strengthened the position of this style mikvah, because now their opposition has been overcome, the mikvah has been built, and the mikvah validity has been verified. So in other words, the same idea. Perhaps it wasn't a good thing. It wasn't, right? This that they had attacked Rabbi Lau and his building of this mikvah wasn't a good thing. But you know what came from it? Something that wouldn't have come had they not attacked it. They strengthened the validity of the mikvah. The validity of the mikvah has been verified. Once again, this idea of everything that happens for a reason, a good reason. There was something good. Either it itself is good or something good will come out of it. And this idea we see with the following story is a story that took place with Senator Jesse Helms. Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina initially was seen as an anti-Semite. I don't remember, I wasn't around then, but initially was seen as an anti-Semite. And we have an interesting story, a story I've shared in the past, of how someone questioned the Rebbe on Chabad's association with Jesse Helms, and the way the Rebbe flipped it, the idea that, again, not focusing on the negativity, not focusing on the challenge aspect, but on the contrary, a deeper perspective that on how to deal with challenging people and what really can come out of it. So let's have a look at this next clip relating another story on this topic.
I remember I had the chutzpah once to write him a letter saying, Rebbe, how come for your 80th birthday, you decided among those you wanted to honor was Senator Jesse Helms? At the time, Senator Jesse Helms could, I think, be fairly described as a Sonei Israel. He was not a friend of the Jewish people. He was not a friend of Israel. So, in my naivete, I wrote the Rebbe a letter. He wrote me back one of the most beautiful responses. He said, you honor not only to influence the past, but to influence the future. He said, watch Senator Jesse Helms over the next years and see whether or not our decision was the correct one. Within a year of that honor, Jesse Helms had become one of the strongest supporters of Israel in the United States Senate. And as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, one of its most important. You live and you learn, and I learned a great deal.
It was just reminded me of a joke. He said, about a committee. It reminded me of the joke. What do you call a group of forgetful Congress people? You call it the Oversight Committee. All right. So what's the story? The story that he shared was a very powerful one. Jesse Helms was considered an anti-Semite at the time. He was not pro-Israel, which is perhaps quite an important point, especially nowadays. And I don't recall exactly. I don't think it was Jesse Helms individually that was honored. I believe it was in 1982, it was a gathering in honor of the Rebbe's 80th birthday that was put on by Friends of Chabad in Washington, which is an important organization till today in Washington. And one of the senators that spoke, if I recall correctly, one of the senators that spoke, or one of the senators that was there, was Senator Jesse Helms. And that raised a few eyebrows, to say the least. And he reached out to the Rebbe and said, Rebbe, why do you honor him? Why do you consider to, have him be a part of it? He's an anti-Semite. And the Rebbe said, wait and see. In other words, what was the Rebbe telling? The Rebbe was saying that when you encounter a challenging person, you can choose to focus on their negativity. You can choose to focus on what that person did wrong, or you can choose to realize that there's more to the person than the negative. When you create that connection with a challenging person, you can unlock great potential. You can unlock the good that person has. And we see this in many areas. We see this in many stories of the Rebbe. There's another story related. Was Rabbi Shmuel Lu. May he live and be well. He's one of the one of the senior Chabad emissaries in England. And early in his career, he had a situation that he shared with the Rebbe, that there's a prominent Jewish leader in Britain that had expressed strenuous opposition to one of the Rebbe's mitzvah campaigns. And so Rabbi Lu was considering putting together a delegation of rabbis to visit this Jewish leader and to talk to him, to persuade him to accept the Rebbe's view on this mitzvah, etc., etc. And he shared this idea with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe told him something very powerful along these lines. And the Rebbe said, there's 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. If this person, this Jewish leader, doesn't want to work with us on this single particular mitzvah, no problem. There's 612 others that we can work together. What is the Rebbe telling Rabbi Lu? Yes, he's got something negative, but that doesn't wipe him off the map. Right? Cancel culture. We're very big nowadays. Right? Someone says something wrong, off the map. No, this rabbi, this Jewish leader, I don't know if it was a rabbi, I don't recall the details of the story, but this Jewish leader doesn't want to work hand in hand with you for this mitzvah. Don't go and try to argue with him and try to deal with him. Don't go there. There's 612 other mitzvahs that we do agree upon, that we could work together. So just as with challenging events, with the situational aspects that we mentioned earlier, when we have challenging people, the idea is this too is for the good. Find the good in the person. Use that moment of adversity, use that challenge as a springboard, as a catalyst for something good. And not just something good, but as here with the story of Jesse Helms, it itself perhaps would lead to something good. It itself will turn out to be good. Which leads us to perhaps the most important part, because it's something that we struggle with on a daily basis. See, until now, we've been discussing adversity from without, right? Situational adversity, natural occurrences, other adversity, people from without, social adversity, and how to deal with that. But perhaps the most important adversity, and one that we read and deal with every single day is the adversity from within. It's our personalities. It's the tough situations that perhaps we have within ourselves, how to perceive negative character traits, how to perceive, what we perceive, how to look at what we perceive as negative character traits. And on these internal challenges, there are a dime a dozen letters from the Rebbe pertaining to these challenges and these bumps and these obstacles in the road. And we'll begin with a very peculiar, interesting story that the Talmud relates, but really it's an important story that really sets the tone for the Rebbe's advice to people in this area. This is text 6. I said we're going to be jumping around. This is text 6. It's on page 129. Let's have a look inside. Text 6, Abaye. Abaye was one of the great sages, Talmudic sages. And Abaye overheard a man suggest to a woman, let's get up early in the morning and travel together. Right? What does Abaye say to himself? Men, woman, single, traveling together. I know what that means, right? Traveling together, it's got a lot of deep connotations. It doesn't just mean, let's, hike the Angeles Forest, National Forest, right? Let's say, So when she agreed, says the Talmud, Abaye told himself, perhaps it was his student, and he said, I'd better follow them to prevent them from doing something forbidden together, right? Classic story, two people, perhaps they were teenagers, whatever it was, and Abaye wants to make sure it's a student, or, whoever it was, he wants to make sure that nothing inappropriate goes on. And what happens? Fascinating. He shadowed them for a distance of 3 parsing, which is Talmudic measurement, approximately 12 miles. It's quite a long walk. I don't know, 15 minutes a mile, right? How long are we holding? A good few hours. Someone just told me last week they walked 32 miles. And they walked from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 32 miles. Not bad. So Abaye over here, he was pretty good in cardio. It's good for the day. He shadowed these two individuals for a distance of 12 miles. He trudged through a reed-filled marsh while they walked along the road beside it, right? He tried to remain inconspicuous. He tried to hide in the marsh. He had a tough time going through, and they were walking. They had a very nice jog. They had a very nice walk. However, says the Talmud, they did not use the isolation and the early hour as an opportunity to sin together. As they parted ways, Abaye heard them commenting, the road was quite a run, but the company was certainly fun. Right? So Abaye here had traveled and he journeyed and he followed them and he shadowed them for 12 miles. And he was sure that he would have to stop some inappropriate behavior, but that moment didn't arrive. And he thought to himself, says the Talmud, Abaye then told himself, if I were that man, I wouldn't have managed to restrain myself from sinning. What do we have here? And we'll conclude the Talmudic statement in a moment. We have a classic case of projection. Why did Abaye think that this man and this woman, right, single man, single woman, walking alone on the road, obviously they have inappropriate goals in mind. So Abaye thought to himself, why did I think that that's what they had in mind? It was a projection, because had I been in that position, that's probably what I would have done. I would have succumbed to my evil inclination and perhaps done something inappropriate. Let's get back to the Talmud. Last paragraph. As he stood in thought, slouched against a doorpost and feeling distressed, right? How can I? A certain elder approached him and said, a greater person has a greater inclination to sin. What happens? What happened here was Abaye had this projection, which in turn meant that perhaps he is on a lower spiritual status than this random individual. Here's Abaye, the great leader, the great Talmudic sage, and he's thinking to himself, am I a rabbi? Am I such a lofty individual? Am I such a holy individual? I'm not so holy. Look at me. I wouldn't have been able to survive a jog of 12 miles with her. I wouldn't have been able to do what he did and not succumb. And this pain, thinking about that, he's standing there in the Beit Midrash, in the Talmudic study hall. He's leaning against the post and he's visually distressed. He's visually in pain. And what happens? This is an idea that perhaps we have in many areas in our life. Not exactly the same as Amaya, but perhaps in various areas in life, we project ourselves on other people and then we feel negative about it, right? What happens? We see someone do something and we say, if only I can be as good as that person, or that person was able to do it, but me, I'd never be able to. Or perhaps, a parent with a child, right? We do something in parenting that we don't feel is the correct way of doing it. And we feel better. We say, you know what, maybe I'm not cut out for this, or at work, or with our peers, or whatever area in life. And we say, look at me. I have this negative character trait that really bogs me down. It bothers me, right? And there's two ways to go about the character trait. And here's a statement from the elder who tells Abaya, a greater person has a greater inclination to sin. What's the elder telling him? The elder is telling him, you know why you feel like you wouldn't have been able to withstand the temptation? Because you are truly greater than this individual. You're greater spiritually. And because you're greater spiritually, you have a greater evil inclination. Your evil inclination is actually more powerful. Now, classically explained, the commentaries explain, what is he saying? Saying as follows. God created man, right? God created people with free will, free choice, right? Now, if we have free choice and we're much holier, then is that free choice? No, we're holier. So obviously our non-holy side is weaker. So that's not free choice. Obviously, we're going to go with the holy side. So the Talmud is telling us, no, God makes the evil inclination equal to the holy inclination. So if one has a small holy inclination, then their evil inclination will be small. If one has a great holy inclination, a great good inclination, then their evil inclination will be equally as great. And so the sage was telling Abaya, if you feel like you have such great temptation, that's because you are such a great man. That's why you have an equally strong temptation, equally strong evil inclination. The Rebbe has a novel approach to this Talmudic passage. A brilliant interpretation that's exactly the opposite. The standard interpretation is that, right? The greater the person, the greater the evil inclination. The more spiritual, the holier the person, the stronger the evil inclination is going to try to pull the individual away from his fulfillment of the commandments. The Rebbe said, no, it's exactly the opposite. What do I mean by the opposite? Sorry for moving myself around the screen. What do I mean by the opposite? The Rebbe says as follows. The individual has this great evil inclination, and because he has overcome it time and again, that is what made him a great person. So it's not because he's a greater person, that's why he has a greater Yitzhahara, a greater evil inclination. Rather, it's because he has this greater evil inclination that has spurred him to become a greater person. What do I mean by that? The Rebbe elaborated on this idea in the beginning of 1969. What took place in 1969, 68, 69 were important years for space exploration, right? We all know it's the first orbit of the moon, first landing of the moon, on the moon, the Apollo missions, space race. Again, I wasn't there. I just remember from reading the stories and hearing the stories, and the Rebbe focused a number of times on these occurrences. Following the orbit of the moon, the Rebbe spoke about space. Following the landing on the moon, the Rebbe spoke about the landing on the moon and its implications and spiritual messages that we can take from it, and lessons that we can take from the space exploration. Fascinating ideas. What we're going to focus on is a talk that the Rebbe gave shortly after the first orbit of the moon, the famous picture of Earthrise, I believe, was in that trip in 1968, December 1968. And shortly after that, the Rebbe utilized the idea of a rocket ship, the space rockets, to explain this story of Abaya, to explain the statement from the elder and this analysis, novel analysis. And the Rebbe said as follows, right? When you have a rocket, right? The farther you want it to go, the more fuel it needs. The more fuel it has, the heavier it becomes, the harder it is for it to go far. So you have this conundrum, or not me or you, NASA scientists had this conundrum, right? We need to find that balance, right? You need to have the fuel, but you can't have it because then that's going to make it heavier and make it harder to reach the moon. I'm oversimplifying a more complex idea. I wasn't going to be studying Newton's third law of motion. I wasn't going to be studying the advantage of equal and opposite reaction, etc. But the idea that the Rebbe shared was that what they had here was to find an interesting balance. And that is that when you load up the rocket with enough fuel, although the fuel seems to be the baggage that weighs down the rocket, on the contrary, it's not baggage, it's something that propels the rocket to reach the greatest heights. Right? By pushing, by letting go of the fuel, it pushes the rocket even farther, etc. But the idea is it's the fuel that on the one hand seems to be the baggage, but on the other hand, it's what propels the rocket to go farther. Let's have a look inside the Rebbe's analog. Text 7 on page 131. In order that the good inclination should be able to soar even higher, there is a need for a tremendous quantity of material, the inclination for evil that stands in opposition. The more this quantity is increased, meaning the more powerful one's inclination for evil, so will the ascent caused by overcoming it be all the higher. The more fuel you have, yes, the heavier it becomes, but you know what? The farther the rocket can go. And so the idea over here is the greater, says the Rebbe, the greater the baggage, the greater the evil inclination, the greater the individual can become. Where are we? Here we are. The greater the individual can become. And this is the message that we can take from the story of Abaya, the message that we can take from this idea is that perhaps it's a Rabbi Akivah perspective. In other words, is it good to have that temptation? Perhaps the temptation itself isn't good, but you know what? It brings to something, it's a catalyst for something much greater, which is overcoming and strengthening one's resolve and strengthening oneself. And perhaps we can apply that to many, many areas in life, many character traits that we look at that perhaps may be something which weakens us, but on the contrary, those ideas strengthen us. And let's have a look on text 8, where the Rebbe shares this idea in a letter correspondence from 1986. Text 8. No human being can answer such questions which only Hashem, the Creator, can answer. Right? We can answer the question why. Why an individual has challenges, why others don't have challenges. One observation, says the Rebbe, that can be suggested in relation to the question, why me? If an individual experiences a particularly difficult or trying situation, it may be assumed that God has given him extraordinary powers to overcome the extraordinary difficulty. The individual concerned is probably unaware of his real inner strength. The trial may therefore be designed for the sole purpose of bringing out in the individual his hidden strength, which, after overcoming his problem, can be added henceforth to the arsenal of his revealed capacities, in order to utilize both for infinitely greater achievements for the benefit of himself and others. Right? Once he reveals that tool that he has in his toolbox, he never knew he has, but now that he revealed it, now he can use it time and again for himself and for others. And so perhaps what the Rebbe is sharing here is that the challenge on the contrary, isn't only something negative, but the challenge itself is actually the greatest gift. Because without this challenge, the person who has immense potential for greatness would have never known that he has that potential. He would never actualize it. By giving this person a tremendous and almost seemingly unbearable challenge, God is giving the person the key with which to unlock their own greatness. And here's a video, I believe it's the final video for tonight, where two individuals share similar ideas where they came to the Rebbe for advice with a character flaw that they felt was a flaw, a character trait that they possessed that they felt was a flaw. And the Rebbe showed each of them how, on the contrary, not only it isn't a flaw, but this character trait is actually one that can be used in the greatest manner possible. Let's have a listen, a view of these two stories.
I came to Crown Heights to try out Yiddishkeit, to go into yeshiva. I wanted to see if I wanted to be religious. I ended up staying there for 4 years, or a little more. In those years, I requested from the Rebbe a tikkun. I wasn't happy with some of the things, the way I behaved in the past. Okay. The Rebbe said, use it as a lever against itself. For example, if you are such an egoist, if you see someone else learning better than you, say to yourself, I can certainly learn better than that. And then go and do it. And when the Yetzer Hara sees what it's being used for, oh, stop bothering me. Okay, that's the end of the Yechidus.
Is doch mit der Erzähle Heike, ist doch verstandig, a jeder Linien, was tut sich in der ewigsten Welt, was dort der Rein und Einziger Balabos, ist doch eine sichere Sache, als in der Ruf muss sein, behalten Teil, und sie mehr nicht wie toll an den Menschen, als soll sich in der Ruf missbeinen sein. Ist auch viele, wenn der Tevis behalten, ist eine sichere Sache, als wird am Eis gefunden.
He was saying to me, you have to realize that God is good, and everything that you experience in this world during your life, even if your own inner negative character traits or whatever, it's all from God, and it all is nothing more than an opportunity.
Benele sei das mehr nicht alle bei, soll suchen, kedorosh, wird sicher gefunden, bis in ein Leben von als bei mit werden richtig, der Tev ist da echt in der Minyan.
When I was studying in Montreal, I was having a great difficulty with my study partner, with my chavrusa. We would be at loggerheads with each other. We would study the Talmud, the Gemara, whatever he would say, I would say differently, whatever I would say, he would say differently. And I went into the Rebbe, I thought there was something wrong with me, that I'm just arguing with the guy all the time. And I told the Rebbe that I need some guidance as to how to handle this. The Rebbe said, it would appear that one of your latent gifts is pilpul, the ability of analyzing and arguing and coming to a certain conclusion, not simply straightforward. The Rebbe said that I should spend time in working at pilpul.
Is a sichere Sache, bechol Linien wie Linien ist dort Tev und Peloschen ha-Yudur, was sagt in Yerushalmi, als ihm reich ist, dass Rumi käm, bemerkt nicht dem Tev, oder ein gefintem nicht, das Humikem, Reiki, Humikem, in der Sibelose, was hat nicht gesucht, wo man darf suchen oder wie man darf suchen.
You know, you could have taken a situation which, well, to me it was quite destructive and quite negative, and the Rebbe saw tremendous power in it and tremendous opportunity, tremendous potential in terms of developing a certain mode of study.
So we see from these two stories this exact idea. In other words, these character traits that these individuals possessed. The first one, Abba Berenson, Brennanson, who was a secular Jew and then came to Crown Heights to become religious. He wasn't sure, and then he stuck around for 4 years, and the rest is history. He currently lives in Kfar Chabad in Israel. He's a scribe, Torah scribe, a sofer, right? And what does he relate? He came to the Rebbe with multiple issues that he had, and one of the issues was that he shared with the Rebbe that he's got a big ego. And the Rebbe didn't tell him having a big ego is bad. Perhaps we may perceive it as a negative character trait. What does the Rebbe tell him? You have a big ego? Amazing. That's a great character trait. Utilize it for the good. Take your big ego and utilize it to gain strength. You see someone else gaining in Torah study, you try to outdo him. Study more Torah, right? So use your ego against itself. Don't look at it as something negative. And Rabbi Lipsker, the director of Chabad of South Africa, right? He had the same thing. He had this argumentative streak in him. He has this, he likes arguing. The Rebbe said, so that's wonderful. You like pilpul. You like the style of Talmudic study, which is analytical and argumentative, which enables one to get down to the nitty-gritty details of it and perhaps discover a novel approach in understanding topics that isn't straightforward. You're argumentative? Amazing. Utilize that against itself. Utilize it in a powerful way. And so we have these three areas in life and these various stories that we shared in letters from the Rebbe, where we see on how to face adversity, whether it's situational or look for the hidden opportunities within the challenging situations, the social adversity, which is try to find and connect with potential and challenging people. See the good outcome in it and perhaps connect with those people, as we saw in the story of Jesse Helms, and the story of Rabbi Lou, connect with the people where we can agree with each other. And then perhaps most importantly, as it relates to ourselves and how to look at ourselves and how to perceive perhaps innate negative character traits, that they aren't necessarily negative. We just have to channel them in the right direction and use them for themselves. Now, there is one area of adversity that we did not touch upon, and I mentioned in the beginning that we're not really going to be touching upon it, and that is the immense tragedies that we face, that sadly, unfortunately, many people face. And then, tremendous tragedies of larger scale on a historical level, the destruction of the temples, the pogroms, the Holocaust, the worst tragedy of them all, the current tragedy of what occurred in Israel. These are tragedies that take a long discussion for a different time, but and a conversation for a different time. But we all wait for the time when God will bring about the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our day, the ultimate redemption, when I guess it's for us to believe that the verse tells us that when Mashiach comes, we will actually see the purpose in the suffering. But it is a point that the Rebbe cried about many times. As a famous clip, I wanted to share it, but I forgot to put it in the PowerPoint beforehand, where the Rebbe cries, talking about this Talmudic passage that says that we will see the purpose and the pain and suffering of the Jewish people. And the Rebbe says, don't give us the pain and don't tell us the purpose. Don't give us the suffering. And so we should have no more suffering, and this shall be with the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days.